A manipulator does not care about the boundaries you announce. They only care about the consequences you are actually willing to execute. In the next 10 minutes, you will understand why explaining your limits invites further abuse, the exact shift from persuasion to consequence, and an operational blueprint to enforce your lines cleanly. Because when you try to convince a manipulator to respect your boundaries, you are handing them an instructional manual to bypass your defenses. In modern popular culture, boundary setting is frequently framed as an act of healthy communication. You are told to use I statements, express your feelings openly, and explain your internal needs so that the other person can understand your perspective and adjust their behavior. For a reciprocally empathic individual, someone capable of receiving that information and allowing it to modify their behavior, this collaborative framework works efficiently. But against a highly manipulative individual exhibiting narcissistic, exploitative, or antisocial behavioral patterns, regardless of formal diagnosis, this framework is completely non-functional. This analysis draws strictly from empirical behavioral conditioning literature and clinical frameworks on interpersonal effectiveness to cut through popular misconceptions surrounding limit setting. The fundamental error targets make when interacting with a manipulator is operating under the compliance fallacy, the belief that the objective of a boundary is to change the other person's behavior. When you anchor your safety to someone else's compliance, you remain structurally dependent on them. Clinically, a boundary is not a rule you impose on someone else to control what they do. A boundary is an explicit statement of what you will do when a non-negotiable threshold is crossed. If you do not master this distinction, your boundaries will remain purely conversational, and a skilled manipulator will simply view them as temporary obstacles to be negotiated down to zero. If this distinction is clarifying something you have been struggling to name, subscribe to the Shadow Protocol and hit like. New clinical analysis every week. Now, let us examine exactly why verbal boundaries fail. To understand why traditional boundaries fail against manipulative personalities, we must examine what happens when you justify your limits verbally. This is the first psychological trap, the information trap. When you tell a manipulator, "Please don't speak to me in that tone," it triggers my anxiety and reminds me of my childhood. You believe you are appealing to their empathy. In reality, you are executing a catastrophic defensive error. You have just provided them with two critical pieces of psychological intelligence. First, that a specific tone effectively deregulates your nervous system, and second, exactly where your historical trauma lines are located. Research on dark triad personality traits consistently suggests that highly manipulative individuals are significantly less likely to process disclosed vulnerability as an invitation to intimacy, and significantly more likely to catalog and deploy it as a strategic advantage. The next time they need to destabilize your equilibrium during a disagreement, they will intentionally deploy that exact tone, knowing your defensive infrastructure is already compromised. Furthermore, the moment you attach a reason to your boundary, you present it as an open item up for debate. If you say, "I can't help you move this weekend because I'm completely exhausted from work," the manipulator does not look at your exhaustion as a fact. They look at it as a proposition to be dismantled. They will counter with, "You just sat at a desk all week. How hard can it be? I worked twice as many hours as you did, and I'm making time for family. So you're saying your comfort is more important than our relationship?" Notice what has occurred. The conversation is no longer about your clear executive decision to stay home. The conversation has been successfully redirected into a grueling debate about whether your fatigue is legally valid enough to justify your choice. By entering the debate, you have implicitly agreed that if they can disprove your reason, your boundary must dissolve. Understanding why the information trap works is half the analysis. The second half is the exact operational replacement, the shift from persuasion to structural statement. Subscribe to the Shadow Protocol and hit like to help this analysis reach others. We deliver structured clinical deconstructions every week to help you decode manipulative behavior and protect your long-term autonomy. Let us return to the analysis. Defending your psychological space requires an absolute transition away from interpersonal persuasion toward explicit unilateral statement. This is the second psychological trap, the persuasion illusion. Foundational systemic communication research establishes that all interactions operate on two distinct levels, the content level and the relationship, or command level. When a manipulator violates your boundary, they are not having a content dispute. They are issuing a direct structural command to test your baseline submissiveness. Manipulators operate exclusively at the command level. Responding at the content level, arguing facts, over-explaining your choices, appealing to logic or fairness, is structurally futile. It is the equivalent of answering a physical shove with a logical rebuttal. The medium of your response is itself the concession. To defeat this, your boundary statements must be stripped of all narrative weight. They must resemble technical documentation, sterile, clear, and totally devoid of emotional pleading. Stop using soft phrases that signal room for negotiation, such as, "I'd really prefer it if you didn't. Could you please try to respect my... I don't think it's fair when you..." These phrases signal to the manipulator that your boundary is an emotional request that can be managed with sufficient counter-pressure. Replace them with structural declarations. State the observation and append the immediate behavioral consequence. If you continue to interrupt my presentation, I am ending this meeting and rescheduling it via email. I am not discussing my financial decisions. If you bring them up again, I am leaving the dinner table immediately. Notice that you are not asking them to stop. You are not begging them to understand. You are simply stating the exact formula of your future behavior. Before we outline the final operational defense framework, the exact mechanics of managing the volatile behavioral reaction that occurs the absolute second a manipulator realizes your boundaries can no longer be negotiated, there is a critical structural counterattack you must anticipate. It is an act of tactical testing designed to probe the absolute elasticity of your lines. Pay close attention to this operational sequence. The moment you transition from verbal pleading to behavioral execution, the manipulator's system will experience a profound crisis of control. While not a formal diagnostic category in the DSM, this dynamic functions as a highly precise behavioral description of the elasticity probe. They will instantly initiate a series of countermeasures to test if your new boundary is solid stone or merely temporary theater. This testing protocol occurs in 3 distinct waves. Applied behavior analysis research has documented a recognized escalation pattern called the extinction burst. When a previously reinforced behavior, in this case successfully manipulating you into compliance, suddenly stops producing results, the behavior does not always immediately disappear. In a significant portion of documented cases, it intensifies first, then erratically tests for any remaining elasticity. Then, if your boundary holds without negotiation, it extinguishes. This pattern is not guaranteed, but it is documented and recognized. And understanding it structurally shifts your position. If escalation follows your enforcement, you are no longer reacting to chaos. You are observing a known behavioral response to the removal of a reinforcer. The manipulator's intensification may be evidence that your boundary is working, not evidence that it has failed. The counterattack arrives in 3 distinct waves. The outrage wave. They will react with intense, disproportionate anger or shock. While this response functions as a behavioral pattern label rather than an official clinical diagnosis, it serves as a highly reliable gauge of the manipulator's desperation to reclaim control. They will accuse you of being cold, calculated, clinical, or unfeeling. Who are you all of a sudden? A robot. You can't even have a normal human conversation. The clinical motive is to provoke a defensive reaction. If you step forward to defend your humanity and say, "No, I'm just trying to be healthy," you have stepped back into the sandbox. Your boundary has been successfully converted back into an argument. The mockery wave. If outrage fails, they will weaponize sarcasm and ridicule. They will make light of your boundaries to minimize their gravity. "Oh, look, someone read a self-help book this weekend. Are you setting a boundary with me right now?" Terrifying. They do this to make you feel foolish or overly dramatic. If you react with frustration or try to prove the seriousness of your boundary, you have handed them emotional supply. The microstep. While not a formal clinical category, the microstep functions as a behavioral description of a deliberate boundary elasticity test. The manipulator will respect the boundary in its macro form but intentionally violate it by an absolute micro increment. If your boundary is, "I will not answer work calls after 7 p.m., they will text you at 7:03 p.m. with a message marked, "Urgent logistics, ignore at your own peril." They are checking for elasticity. If you answer that text, you teach them that your boundary line actually expires at 7:05 p.m. You have validated their infiltration framework. Now, you understand the 3 waves of counterattack. The final section is the protocol that defeats all 3, without a single word of argument. Defeating the counterattack requires a complete adherence to the action over argument protocol. You must execute 3 non-negotiable rules the exact second your behavioral thresholds are breached. 0 warning cycles. Do not issue serial warnings. Do not say, "This is your second warning. If you do it again, I'm going to leave." A warning is simply an announcement that you are willing to tolerate at least one more instance of disrespect before taking action. It signals structural weakness. You state the boundary exactly once at the beginning of the interaction. The very first time the line is crossed, you do not issue a reminder. You execute the consequence immediately. Consider the following scenario. You are at a family dinner. Before the meal begins, you state clearly, "I am not discussing my finances tonight. If it comes up, I am leaving the table." 20 minutes in, the subject arises. The instinct will be to say, "I told you, I said I am not discussing this." Suppress it. Do not say it. Stand up, place your napkin on the table, and excuse yourself. The warning has already been issued. The consequence is already executing. The monosyllabic pivot. When executing the consequence, you must completely refuse to engage with the manipulator's outrage or mockery. Do not explain why you are executing the consequence. The boundary statement already established the criteria. Use a monosyllabic pivot script or maintain absolute silence. If you are leaving the room because they insulted you, do not launch into a lecture as you walk out. Say cleanly, "As stated," and step away. Any additional words you speak act as fuel for their counterattack. Instant physical severance. A boundary requires physical or structural distance to exist. It cannot be maintained while sitting across a table from someone who refuses to respect your sovereignty. If the boundary condition dictates that the conversation is over, you must physically remove yourself from the environment instantly. Hang up the call, close the laptop, walk out of the room, step into your vehicle and drive away. Do not wait for their permission to end the interaction. You are not arriving at a mutual agreement. You are executing a unilateral decision for your own protection. The exit itself requires no drama. If you are on a call, you say, "As stated," and end it. the line goes silent. You place the phone face down and do not retrieve it for the consequence window you established in advance. If you are in a physical environment, a living room, an office, a vehicle, you move toward the exit immediately. No lingering, no dramatic pause, no final attempt to be understood. The movement is the statement. Your personal boundaries are not a negotiation with an external operator. They are a private, unshakable covenant with yourself. The moment you stop looking for their agreement and simply enforce your consequences, you structurally remove most of the leverage a manipulator depends on. Once you have internalized this behavioral framework of consequence execution, you may find that the manipulator's persistent testing necessitates an absolute termination of the channel. When boundaries are met with structural counterattacks, the next logical operational phase is the total removal of your cognitive infrastructure from their environment. To understand the exact neurobiological and defensive mechanics of executing this final firewall, watch our comprehensive guide to the psychology of going no contact right here on the left. Maintain your baseline. Protect your reality. We will see you in the next analysis.